the nature and the extent of the control, of the internalized violence, the cruelty of the laws that leaves no exit for people. You know that if you're a Palestinian fighting in the legal system, you're almost bound to lose. That's cruel to a deep, deep level. That has taken my breath away.
Israeli laws, policies, and practices against the Palestinian people amount to apartheid, according to a report issued by Amnesty International. A report that was welcomed by the Palestinian leadership and the Palestinian people as a very professional report. To talk more about that, I have with me the Secretary General of Amnesty International, Dr. Callamard. Welcome to our program, Dr.
Thank you very much for having me here.
You're welcome. The report issued about your organization states that Israeli laws, policies, and the practices against the Palestinian people in the occupied territory, in Israel proper and around the world, amount to apartheid. And you describe it as institutionalized.
Yeah.
So how significant it is, the term institutionalized, and the fact that it covers all the Palestinian people in the occupied land in Israel and the refugees?
Thank you very much. Amnesty International has undertaken the research into the system in place against all Palestinians, and after 4 years of investigation, we concluded that the system amounted to a system of apartheid. Why? Because the policies, the laws, and the practices all together over the years have sought to impose domination, oppression, control over the Palestinian people with the view, with the intention of ensuring demographic hegemony by the Jewish population over the Palestinian and the maximum control over the land. That, in a nutshell, is a definition of a system of apartheid. A range of laws, policies, institutions. It's not an incident. It's not an example. It is literally a system of, of course, people, decision makers, legal framework, policy decisions, practices on the ground. It's all of those things together that constitute a system. And in the case of Israel, that system is meant to control and to oppress the Palestinian people, and it is meant to ensure that they, as a racial group, are dominated by the Jewish people. In essence, that is what a system of apartheid constitutes, and that was our conclusion. Now, Amnesty International has determined that while there are differences between Israel proper, between the occupied territory, and between the refugees living abroad, the system altogether is very similar in its intention and in the way it's being implemented. And this is why we have concluded that the system of apartheid is in place in all those territories and against different people, including the Palestinian inside Israel, the Palestinian in the occupied territories, and the refugees living abroad. We recognize that there are differences between all three groups, but the differences do not mean that the system differs.
Yes, and the report also highlights the issue of the Palestinian refugees and their right to return home. And we know of the continuing Israeli policies and attempts to wipe off the right of the refugees. So how important it is that your report is bringing this issue once again to the foreline?
I think it is important at two levels. The first one, it is important to recognize that even though refugees live abroad, the Israeli authorities continue to exercise power and control over them because they are preventing them from returning, and because the prevention to return is in contradiction with their treatment of Jewish people. Yes. So the Palestinians are prevented from returning to their land. The Jewish people are encouraged to come to Israel. So that is why we are saying, and the argumentation is much more complex. I'm summarizing it. That is why we are saying that the Israel authorities continue to exercise control over the rights of the refugees of Palestine. That does not mean that Lebanon or Jordan or any other places, the authorities of those countries have no responsibilities. On the contrary, they do have a lot of responsibilities, and we have highlighted those many times and denounced the treatment of Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. But that does not mean that there is no responsibility for the Israeli authorities. On the contrary. So the right of return for us is part of our analysis. This is not the first time that we are claiming that the Palestinians have a right of return. They have a right of return under international law, under the 1951 Convention. They have a right of return. It is a logical recommendations for us to make on the basis of the principles and international law.
Yes, and different organizations and different states welcomed your report. For example, the Palestinian leadership and the Palestinian people described it as a very professional report, and yes, it is. Israeli human rights organizations like B'Tselem, for example, welcomed the report. The EU issued a statement last night saying we give due attention to Amnesty International report. So in light of these positions, okay, how we can build on this report for future steps to end apartheid and realize the rights of the Palestinians?
Thank you. As you have pointed out, that report is not the first one to be concluding that there is a system of apartheid and indeed crimes of apartheid. We have not talked about the crimes, but B'Tselem has done so, Palestinian organizations have done so for many years now, Human Rights Watch has done so. So my hope, of course, is that Amnesty report contribute to building the momentum around the realization around the world that there is a system and crimes of apartheid against Palestinians. We need to ensure that the international community cannot turn away from the reality on the ground and cannot, decide not to engage with the reality. The crimes of apartheid, the crimes against humanity of apartheid are particularly crucial because under international law, every country is duty-bound to respond to the existence of crimes against humanity. So I hope that this report is going to contribute to creating a momentum so that the international community can take further actions about addressing the situation. For us at Amnesty International, the report is also an important step towards saying we can no longer just focus on the human rights violation. We need to look at the root causes. And we need to look at the system which permit the violations to take place and the violation to take place in impunity. So for Amnesty International, that report is also a call to everyone else around the world and in Israel and in Palestine to say, let's consider the root causes of those violations and tackle the root causes. We are planning a range of intervention in response to the launch of the report. That's just the first step for us, what happened yesterday. There are many more steps that we are planning over the months and years to come.
Yes, and the Palestinian leadership has announced many times that the issue of the Israeli apartheid shall be submitted to the ICC and to the International Court of Justice. So I think that your report is starting a new chapter in international legal documentation of the human rights violations. So how can we use it?
I hope you're right, because one of the key recommendations we have made is for the International Criminal Court to include the crime of apartheid in its investigation. So far it has not. It's starting an investigation, but there is no crime of apartheid included. So we are calling on the International Criminal Court to do that. We are absolutely open for the report to be the object of rigorous legal engagement. We need to build up, as you pointed out, that legal ownership around the situation, that legal scholarship around the situation. Of course, people may say, all of that are words, it won't impact on the ground. I think it can impact, because the more people engage with the issue, whether they agree or disagree, they will need to engage with the evidence, and that is important. So you're perfectly correct. I have no doubt that our report is going to contribute to debate within the legal community, within the international community, and that is important. The thing that we cannot afford, that the Palestinian cannot afford, is status quo and silence. So anything that can break the status quo, anything that can break the silence is important. And I hope that in part the report will do that. But not just that. I think we will be planning to do far more. As a campaigning organization, Amnesty International is going to campaign on the crimes being committed. It's going to campaign on various aspects of the system. We're going to advocate and campaign for, within Israel, the repeal of the basic law on the nation state, which creates second-class citizen in the constitution of Israel, of Arab citizen. That must go. If the Israel authorities want to pretend that there is no system of apartheid, the first thing they need to do is to repeal that basic law. Let's give them that challenge. That basic law institutionalize second-class citizen. That is unacceptable. So we will campaign on that. We will campaign on the situation of the Bedouin in Israel proper. We will campaign on the situation here of Palestinian villages which are seeing their lands taken away by settlement, by outpost, by all kind of Israeli-led enterprise. That is not acceptable. We will campaign on specific examples as symbols of the system of apartheid. And of course, we will work internationally with the International Criminal Court, with the UN. So the report is only one first step for us.
Yes, and you're talking about this important campaign, but there are challenges ahead. And just yesterday, the Israeli Foreign Ministry and other Israeli officials commented on your report and said that it is anti-Semite and it aims to delegitimize the state of Israel. So how do you respond to that? And do you have a plan in the future to defy and refute these claims?
Well, our work speaks for itself.
Yes.
We have taken strong positions against anti-Semitism every time we have been confronted by it, whether in act or in words. We are an anti-racist organization, and we combat racism in all its form and shape, including anti-Semitism. With regard to the state of Israel, as I have said repeatedly for the last 2 days. First of all, Amnesty International recognizes the claim of self-realization by the people of Israel and self-determination by the people of Israel and indeed by the people of Palestine. We are not suggesting that the people, the Jewish people of Israel and of the world, in fact, do not have a valid claim to self-determination. We also do not contest the existence of the state of Israel. And I know that for some Palestinians, they disagree with our position. We stand firm on the fact that there is a state of Israel and that we need to engage with it. We do not even contest the Jewish nature of the state of Israel. What we are saying is that Jewish or non-Jewish, the state of Israel must respect the rights of all the people on its territories, and it must respect international law with regard to the occupied, to the places that it occupies. So it is not about the existence of the state, contrary to what the authorities are saying. Our work speaks for itself. As you know, we have criticized the Palestinian authorities as well when they have violated rights. We have criticized Hamas when it has targeted civilian population in Israel. So our work speaks for itself. I will invite people to look at the work of Amnesty International. In terms of what the Israeli authority may do next against Amnesty International, we'll have to wait and see. I can't predict. My hope is that what they will do next is engage with the substance of our work instead of targeting us and using all kind of barefaced lies.
Yes, and my final question to you, Dr. Callamard, while you're coming from Jerusalem to Ramallah, and I hope that you would have enough time to go to other Palestinian towns and villages, and you see the fragmentation state that the Palestinians live and how they are ringed by colonial settlements. Tell me about your personal now, as a person, feelings towards that.
Thank you. So it was my first visit to Israel, Palestine, and I have worked in the field of human rights for more than 20 years. I've covered many countries, indeed many armed conflict as well. So I am used to being in situations of violence. And what has struck me during that mission is not the level of physical violence, even though it is there. But I have been in places where there was far more violence, Iraq or Syria. What has struck me is how the system and the crimes of apartheid have been internalized within the system. It's almost a silent violence. It is a violence that eats at the soul of people and of communities. It is a violence that destroys the sense of being, the sense of belonging. It is a violence that people can very easily ignore if they want to ignore it, because it is so intricate, it is so weaved in the way institutions work. You can live your life and never experience that level of violence, particularly if you are a Jewish citizen of Israel. And that is striking to me. That has taken my breath away. The level of physical segregations, how it is for all of us to see, but you may never see it because you live in a place where the others don't exist. There are walls separating you from the others, so you don't see it. You drive on your own road. Yeah. That level of segregation is unbelievable, all the way to being absurd at times. I visited in the West Bank this family whose house is completely surrounded by fences so that their Jewish neighbors will not see them. I mean, and then they had to build a little bridge to allow them to walk into their own Palestinian settlement. It's crazy. It's crazy, that level of hatred and distrust that you have to do that. I was struck as well by what I saw in the Bedouin communities, really very poor villages, poor communities, derelict houses. I'm talking here about unrecognized villages mostly. And I'm thinking, it's unbelievable. I mean, this is less than 3% of the Negev area. The Bedouin community is inhabiting lands that are so small compared to the entire Negev area. And yet, that is considered as too much. And yet, they cannot rebuild, they cannot improve their houses, otherwise it's going to be destroyed. And yet, they are confronting the orders for house demolition, even though they have lived there all their life. Their fathers have lived there all their life. They cannot cultivate their lands. They cannot herd their sheep. I mean, and it's such a small percentage. It's no danger to anything, and yet it's seen as too much. Yeah. That has taken my breath away. The nature and the extent of the control, of the internalized violence, the cruelty of the laws that leaves no exit for people. That if you're a Palestinian fighting in the legal system, you're almost bound to lose. That's cruel to a deep, deep level. That has taken my breath away.
Yes, and Secretary General of Amnesty International, Dr. Callamard, it was really great honor and pleasure for us to have you on our show, in our studio. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for watching, and from me, Usama Nazal. Have a nice time and goodbye.